years ago, the paper I wrote, or the approach I took, was sort of looking at what would the utilities be of high-speed rail in the United States? What benefits would it bring? Why would you do it? What would positive would happen from it? And what are the challenges to that becoming, not so much to becoming a reality, but once you decide to do it, to actually implementing it. And in 2012, I suggested that, as Michael alluded to earlier, and as the maps we've looked at show, that the national network, unless it was really, really, really high speed, probably super doable, but there are an accumulation of regional networks that could make a de facto national network that could really significantly alleviate interstate highway congestion in some of these corridors, in some of these regions. The Northeast, the Mid-Atlantic, Southeast, Florida, Texas, California. But that high-speed rail could really potentially do a lot here. Way you could do, in addition to pulling car trips off the road, you could also really have some significant benefits in terms of eliminating a lot of short haul, or drastically reducing a lot of short haul flights, which would help reduce airspace and airport congestion, and also have some pretty significant environmental impacts in terms of the emissions that come from burning jet fuel on takeoffs and landings on short haul flights. And so, and then related to that, there could be kind of these last 2 points here, increased speed over that of vehicle speed. So you're traveling, 2.5, 3 times faster than a vehicle, depending on how fast you drive and how fast the train goes. But you've got greater comfort and less security, wait time procedures than you do with airplane travel. Right. And you can also free up users during travel time, instead of being required to drive a car or being required to be vacuumed into an airplane seat, that really isn't particularly the most comfortable way to travel. The main challenges that stood out to me were one was the right of way. If you use existing rail, you've got some pretty significant engineering issues to get high-speed rail to work on it. And if you get new right of way, that's a whole, as was given in the Texas example, that's a whole other ball game. What will the service provision be? Are we thinking Amtrak is going to be national high-speed rail? Will the private sector do it totally private? Will these public-private partnerships or consortiums? Will it be a mix of those? And then the last one that stood out to me was the first and last mile problem. And that everywhere that we've looked at that has high-speed rail has really good transit at the high-speed rail terminus and everywhere it stops. Would those then be connected to airports, because you're not replacing all air travel? And in fact, if you're moving a lot of short haul flights, your trip there are a lot of trips that could potentially include partially a train trip and then transferring to an airport for an airplane for a much longer trip. And then what about the stop frequency between major metropolitan areas? The story, one of the stories of the interstate highway is the winners and losers of small towns that did have access versus that got passed over by the interstate highway, and the significant economic effects that occurred related to that. So what are some, in looking back at that at 2012 and then thinking, okay, what changed since then that might influence this? In terms of utilities, we didn't have shared mobility like we do now. We didn't have Uber and Lyft like we did now. And we didn't have at least the thought of the momentum behind automation, connected autonomous vehicle technology. And so to me, it stands out that it's possible that some of the things that we think would really particularly benefit by having high-speed rail may also at least potentially be seen by having an autonomous and shared automobile network. Now, whether we will have that is a whole other story, but that's kind of a wrinkle that stood out to me. In terms of replacing short haul flights, the invasion of Ukraine by Russia once again highlights the geopolitically unstable nature of where oil is remaining, and how that then influences our ability to afford travel that is solely dependent on that fuel. You also have more, another thing we have now that we didn't have then was a really serious momentum behind electrification of surface transportation, particularly vehicles. And I started researching electric vehicles in 2009 or whatever. I did not think I would still be researching them at this point, much less that they would have the apparently almost inevitable future that they appear to have. So that's a significant component of the idea of moving transportation away from something that is fuel based. And so maybe that could help play into something like rail that would run, if not off electrification, at least off of a much more efficient, passenger per mile gallon rate, diesel engine or some kind of hybrid. Security, in terms of, sort of kind of one of those comfort questions of finding a nice sweet spot in there of speed and travel time. Security is still a pain with travel. Air travel has gotten amazingly safe with respect to crashes. It had already started to then, but the safety record in the United States, anyways, of airline travel is really quite extraordinary over the last 20 years compared to the history of it before then. And I think an undertold story. That being said, air travel still isn't really comfy, and in the mask COVID era, we've seen that there's, it may be safe with respect to crashes, but maybe not as safe with respect to the comedy and the behavior of passengers and travelers on airplanes. And related to that, in terms of freeing up users during travel time, so you're not just committed to driving a car or confined to an airplane seat. Again, you have that potential with automation and shared mobility, maybe providing that instead, and there being more momentum behind that. Air travel hasn't gotten any better. Airplane Wi-Fi is still bad. It's marginally better than it was 10 years ago. That seems really striking to me that it's still pretty mediocre. And then the long-term impact of COVID-19 on travel and proximity preferences, that story's yet to be told. I've seen the death in life of density and traveling close to the other, foretold a few times within then and now. I'm not sure there will actually be any significant long-term change. It still remains to be told. In terms of updates to 2022 to challenges in the last 10 years, in terms of there being like some kind of major public sector support for major public sector investment and taking of using eminent domain to gather land for a public good like this, like high-speed rail. There doesn't seem to be any kind of support for that. In fact, there's increasing hostility toward the existence of a public sector, much less it having the role of being involved in managing and contributing to society. Amtrak, if you are talking about using existing things through Amtrak, there's a cooperative model there with freight, but there's also one where, push comes to shove, freight can, sort of tend to get its way, or at least really significantly hold up or interrupt anything that might be seen as benefiting Amtrak at their expense or high-speed rail at their expense. In terms of the provision model, the Biden administration has targeted Amtrak with their proposals for infrastructure investment. The partnerships and consortiums that do exist, Andy covered nicely in terms of their difficulty of progressing in the California example. There was an example from several years ago in Florida of there being some pretty significant momentum from one going from Tampa to Orlando, which is a particularly short, congested space that air travel can't serve, and there's not really the will or the interest in expanding the highway, and it just cost and political friction just killed it, and it went from seeming something that at least locally seemed like was had a lot of potential to happen to being dead in the water. There's also an issue that proposed networks, even that what we've looked at and even what you see being introduced, still miss some important interregional connections. And I'll end with the Amtrak map, the 2035 map that they look at, and with the question mark of, is this what high-speed rail will look like in 2032 when we're meeting and doing this again in 10 years? hopefully in person or maybe from outer space. I really have no idea what to guess. In addition to the speed things that have been mentioned and covered well, I will look at this map and say, there are still important regional connections that are missing even in this scenario. A system that doesn't go from Louisville to Nashville, for example, or if you wanted to go from Nashville to anywhere on the East Coast or anywhere west, that involves almost an airline type trip down to Atlanta and catching another line up north or another line south. Whereas a really useful regional network wouldn't be quite so hub and spoke off the really large cities in that region. It would be a little bit more of an interconnected web. And so in conclusion, I would like to see something. It'd be nice to see continued investment in this. The political environment in the United States is just so hostile right now that I don't see a push toward support of investment that, hey, we need this. The way that I would see anything like that happening is instead it's something like, almost the public sector has failed us in a private sector entity or partnership that is much more at the state or regional level. That would be where we would need to, that would be where it would come from. I had this awesome closing piece I was going to bring, and then I couldn't find it. We moved a couple of months ago, and so there's still sort of boxes everywhere. But about a year and a half ago, I was cleaning out my parents' house, and I came across, they had saved the paper from the day that my first grade teacher had retired. This was in April of 1991 or 1992. And the only reason I mention that is that the headline of the Austin American Statesman that day in Texas was the agreement of the Texas Triangle Consortium to start construction and purchase rail cars on the Texas Triangle running from Dallas and Fort Worth through Austin to San Antonio to Houston and back up to Dallas, Fort Worth. And this was a go. This was going to happen. And it was started, and then kind of fledgling little regional airline called Southwest ultimately filed a kind of, I think it was an antitrust suit or something like that, and the project ultimately died. And I often sit and think just how different, as a native Texan, just how different that state would look if we'd had high-speed rail for 30 years now, and if that had occurred, how many other places might have been invested in high-speed rail, and just how different this conversation might have been just from one lawsuit by a little fledgling airline. A fascinating what if questions. So, and I will leave it at there.